Hi, everyone. I'm Thane Rosenbaum, and I'm the creative director of the Forum on Life, Culture, and Society at Touro University. And in collaboration and co-production with our friends at Jazz at Lincoln Center, welcome to the FOLCS Conversation Series. Tonight, a very, very special event. It is a tribute to civil rights icon and leader Bayard Rustin. And for those of you who don't know, he was a giant of the civil rights movement, and we'll discuss why you may or may not have heard of him. We have two very special guests. The first is one of my favorite people in the world, are multi-instrumentalists, and Bryan Carter really is. He not only plays many instruments, he's an orchestrator and arranger. And he has written incredible amounts of music. And if you went to see Some Like It Hot on Broadway, you will know that he cleaned up on all the award shows for his orchestration. I think he won a Tony and a Grammy and Drama Desk Award. I'm not sure anyone's ever done that before. He's an immensely talented guy. And guess what? He has written a tribute to Rustin. He calls it a jazz oratorio, and it's called Rustin in Renaissance. It will be premiering here in New York City at Jazz at Lincoln Center on October 18th and 19th. If you're in New York, you should go. If you're not in New York, you should come to New York. This is worth seeing. And so we have a lot to talk about with him. And we also have with us Walter Naegle, who is the former partner of Bayard Rustin, who died in 1987. And they were together for the last 10 years of his life. Walter is the one who received the posthumous Presidential Medal of Freedom that Barack Obama bestowed on Rustin. He still runs a number of different nonprofits that are dedicated to the work of Rustin. And so two men who knew him, and we have this musical performance that it was inspired by him. We're coming to you tonight, as we always do, from our FOLCS studio. If you have any questions, you can leave them there. There's two buttons. One is for donate. Another one is to say, oh my God, I can't believe I get to hear Bryan Carter. I'm going to tell my cousin. That second button is for your cousin. You can send him a link or her a link and say, hurry up, go watch Bryan. This is not our first program that we've co-hosted with Jazz at Lincoln Center. During the pandemic, actually, we were with Wynton Marsalis, who had a record that also had a civil rights theme. And he was at the piano the whole time, and it was just a blast, if you remember. And if you don't remember, you can go on to our website and watch Wynton, and you'll see Wynton with Bryan on the 18th and 19th. So let's welcome Bryan and Walter. Hi, guys.
Hello.
Hey. Hi.
So of course. Well, let's start with a little preview of the music. Let's start with the appropriate beginning. Let's play out a little of the music from Rustin in Renaissance. So, Bryan, now's the time for me to go fanboy on you. You're one of my favorite guys. That was awesome.
Oh, thank you.
Normally we see Bryan. You saw Bryan functioning as a conductor. He was also playing an instrument. Sometimes he's on the drums and somehow at the same time, we'll see that later, he's on the drums and also functioning as the conductor. So we'll see that later on. So let me start with Bryan. Why Rustin? And why music? What is it about Rustin that inspired you? And do you think that he is a particularly good subject for a piece of music? And I will say one last thing. As you saw from Rustin in Renaissance, it's it's jazzy. It's funny when I listen to this, I think, yeah, that when I was at Some Like It Hot, it had the same upbeat, get up and dance feel. And so when we think of the civil rights movement, I don't know if we think of this, but yet you did. You came up with, and I'm going to ask Walter in a moment whether or not this is the music in some ways personifies the man.
Sure. You know, I think when I decided to take on Rustin, uh, it really came from a place of just utter confusion as to why I had not heard of him, why I didn't know more about him. We were actually in workshops for Some Like It Hot, and I started reading a bit about Bayard Rustin, and I went to Mark Shaman and I said, "Mark, have you heard of this guy?" And he said, "No, I haven't." I said, "You should write a musical about him. He's so interesting." And a few days later, Mark saw him and he said, "Yeah, I read about the guy. An interesting figure." I go, "Yeah, you should totally write a musical about him." And he looks at me and he goes, "No, you should write a musical about him." And I was like, "Oh, well, maybe not a musical, but you know, I thought like, how can I write a piece about this person's life, and about all the incredible things that they did? And would it be an opera? Would it be a ballet? You know, what's a medium that would be appropriate?" And an oratorio or something that was oratorio like came to mind. You know,
So
the big problems. Sorry, good.
No, go ahead, Bryan.
The big problem, you know, with writing a musical piece about, you know, a historical figure, especially one where there are surviving partners and surviving friends and people who knew them intimately, is that with a piece of music, it's not a film, it's not, you know, a biography. You know, there's really only so much of the story that you can tell. But what's unique about music, especially in this setting with an orchestra, is that you don't really have to cover their whole life. You don't have to tell every anecdote or every story. You can let the music speak for you. And more importantly, we care more about the feelings that we're able to convey via the music.
So, for the audience who don't know, and frankly, Bryan, I must tell you, my heart sank when you told me that Mark Shaman didn't know who he was, because he's closer to my generation. So you'll know, Bayard Rustin is my favorite civil rights leader and always was. I'm a man of a certain age, gentlemen. And my family and I read him in Commentary Magazine. We were very aware of his story. Frankly, as Jews and as Holocaust, my parents were Holocaust survivors, we were very sensitive to the fact that this man was trying to build bridges between blacks and Jews. And we also knew that he was the one, I like to call him like the civil rights whisperer. He's the one that really was the tactician for Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King did not know about Gandhi's passive nonviolent resistance. He was one of the two main advisors to King. And as I say, I think that he was involved in more ways than we even realize. But we do know that he is the one that organized the Montgomery bus boycott. We know that he organized the March on Washington, which to this day is the largest peaceful protest we've ever had in the United States. And it was extraordinary that something like that could be done without TikTok, right? This was 1963, that he was able to mobilize with buses. There was no internet. People came from all over the country. It is truly extraordinary. So Rustin, to me, has always been a very tragic figure, because I've always thought, well, why don't we know him? He seems like a forgotten man. But before we get to Walter, I just want to have the audience know that I think that this is an example of like Mean Boys, Mean Girls, Mean Boys, that the other civil rights leaders, I've always thought, were jealous of him. I think that they knew he was smarter, that he was very charismatic. They knew that he was the one that put Martin Luther King in play. He's the one that gave Martin Luther King the confidence to become Martin Luther King. So the NAACP, the various other civil rights leaders, Adam Clayton Powell, who was a congressman out of Harlem, I think they were all jealous of him. Now, I know that there was this issue of him being gay, and he eventually was asked to leave the movement and he felt betrayed by the civil rights leaders, including people like Stanley Levinson, another a Jewish advisor to King, and also King himself. I guess the most important question for you, Walter, is did did Bayard feel betrayed? Was he bitter? Did he, did he walk around for those years before he was brought back in, reluctantly, begrudgingly brought back in? Did he walk around bitter about what they did to him?
No, absolutely not. No, he may have been bitter for a few hours. Um, maybe came home and licked his wounds a little bit. But Bart was not a single issue person. Before the movement really took off in Montgomery, he had been involved for 10, 15 years before that in peace work and peace activism with the Fellowship of Reconciliation, with the American Friends Service Committee, and in human rights work in general. He was over in Africa in the early 50s, consulting with Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and Azikiwe of Nigeria about anti-colonialism and the movement over there. So he was not somebody who sat home waiting to be called back. He always had another project or another cause to go to. So if he was bitter at all, it was for a very short time.
So did that figure into your orchestration and composition, Bryan, that what we just heard was very upbeat, and one could imagine a tragic figure, a broken man who, was brought back, an unsung hero brought back, but, that you could tell the story with great pathos and sadness. You did not. And I guess what I'm asking is, does the music deliberately capture an optimism about Rustin?
Sure. When I read about Rustin, I surely feel optimistic, but I also feel uh, I feel sadness, and I feel all the things that you described as well. And I think that throughout this 7 movement piece, we touch on all sorts of emotions. The clip that you played, it's funny that you brought up the jealousy of the other leaders. Uh, the name of that piece is "The Big Six Show," and of course, the Big Six were uh, the leaders of those organizations that were a part of the March on Washington. And like the first lyric is well, in case you didn't know, we're the Big Six Show. We're the leaders of the movement, a real SRO. Yes, we have our own opinions that we think is right. That's why when we come together, we just bicker and fight. I wanted to kind
That's
of
great.
reimagine this, as you described, in this group of mean boys. I was like, what if I wrote a game theme, a game show theme for them? Instead of
I
having
love
it
that.
be this tragic, these people would excluded him and they wouldn't let him speak. Instead of doing
And,
that, let's make it,
and they,
more satirical.
yeah, I love that, and it also makes it more buffoonery a little, like that they lose stature, right? By doing this, they lose stature. They have stature, but they're not acting
Sure.
like men of stature, right? They're acting like guys. I was just watching the other day the movie Rustin, which I know Walter was an advisor, consultant in the film, and I love that ending where they all go off to meet President Kennedy in the White House, and they invite Walter, and he doesn't feel like he needs to go, but they are like skipping. They're so excited to go into the Oval Office and get a picture. And to me, the message was he was so above all that stuff. He was just above it. There was more dignity to this man than, oh my God, I really want a picture with the president. Let's meet a little of Bayard through a little clip.
I have skills which are good at analyzing problems. I have skills that are good in planning and executing. And I drew up the first plans for SCLC because Martin asked me to. I helped plot the strategy for the Montgomery protest because he asked me to. I put on the March on Washington for all the civil rights leaders because they asked me to. And I was always comfortable at being of service to whoever were the leaders. I do not consider myself a leader.
The modesty of that gentleman, right? Here's the guy that may have been the intellectual guru of the civil rights movement. Here's the guy that convinces Martin Luther King, you have the charisma to be our leader. Here's the guy that pisses off all the other civil rights leaders because they're intimidated by him. And he basically says, look, I did all this stuff because I was asked to do it and I knew I was good at it. But I didn't feel like I was the leader when in fact I, as a boy growing up, gentlemen, I thought he was the leader. You could not have told me in my house that he wasn't the leader. My parents would have said, Bayard Rustin's the leader. He's one of the main leaders. So I love that clip. Here's something that's interesting. We did an event on the film Marshall a number of years ago. I don't know if you saw it. It starred the late Chadwick Boseman, who played Thurgood Marshall. It had Sterling K. Brown in it. It had Kate Hudson and Josh Gad. And there was something in the movie that was an interesting scene that was like right out of the Harlem Renaissance. And you saw it's really about a young marshal handling a rape case. A black chauffeur is accused falsely of raping his client, the woman he's chauffeuring. And Marshall at the time was a young lawyer with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and he goes to Connecticut to handle the case, and he's paired up with a Jewish lawyer. So it's a buddy movie. It's a Jewish guy and a black guy. They're both working together. And in the movie, there's this really great scene where he's in one of the clubs in Harlem, a jazz club. And, he's dressed great. He's young. He's not the Thurgood Marshall on the Supreme Court. He's a young dude. I remember telling Reginald, I can't remember his name, who directed the film. It was like Marshall had on his best Mac Daddy. He looked like, this really cool cat, in Harlem. And I think it's interesting because it's not an accident, right? Rustin was musical, right? Rustin recorded music. This is something that people don't know. Is that something that you knew before you started this? And Walter, maybe after that, you can jump in and say, yeah, you better believe it. Walter was listening to music and playing music all the time.
Sure. Yeah, that's definitely, at the beginning of my research of Rustin, I quickly found his recordings. I found the lute and vocal recordings. I, found out that he was on Broadway very briefly. And, more importantly, Walter, I'll share this story. Walter and I, the first time we met, we got stranded on New Jersey Transit together. And I had some time to ask Walter, if he knew some of my heroes, from the idiom of jazz, like Billy Strayhorn and Duke Ellington, and just, people who would have been
Bryan?
his contemporaries. I'll let Walter.
Okay.
I'll let Walter.
Walter, tell us how musical Bayard was.
Well, Bayard's musical training went all the way back to elementary school. He was raised at a time when the public schools had arts training, poetry, classical music, debating, all of the things that a lot of the schools are missing nowadays. And he had a wonderful tenor voice. And so he grew up singing in the AME church, although he was Quaker, but he also sang in the AME church. And when he went to Wilberforce University and Cheney State College, now Cheney State University, he was in the choir and the quartet at both of those places.
Wait,
so
hold on a second, Walter. I thought he had a music scholarship. I thought he was there on music scholarship. Am I right?
He got a scholarship for Wilberforce, but he did not complete his studies there. He transferred. He went to Cheney, and then he came to New York. And as Bryan mentioned, he was briefly in a musical play called John Henry, which starred Paul Robeson, and he went on to be one of Josh White's backup singers. It was Josh White and the Carolinians, and Bayard sings background on one of Josh's most famous albums is called Chain Gang, and Bayard, as someone actually who ended up serving time on a chain gang a little later, is one of the backup singers in that on that album. So
are you both? Are you both? Certainly, Walter, you would know more about this. Of the view that Bayard would have gotten a real kick out of Rustin in Renaissance, that this would have been to him the kind of tribute that would be specially meaningful coming from someone with the talent of Bryan Carter.
Oh, I think he'd be delighted. Just the clips that I heard, and as you mentioned, I think, or Bryan mentioned, Bayard did know Duke and Billy Strayhorn, because they were very close friends of Marion, a singer named Marion Bruce, who later became Marion Bruce Logan. She was married to Dr. Arthur Logan. And Marion and Dr. Logan were very close advisors to Dr. King. And they lived here in New York up on West 88th Street. So when Dr. King was in town, people would have a powwow, if you will, up at the Logan's house, and Dr. King would be there, and Duke might come by, Billy Strayhorn, well, that whole crowd, because,
Wow.
they were musicians, but they were very supportive of the movement.
Of course. No, and in fact, many of them came and appeared on the March in Washington, right? Many of the leading African-American musicians of that era, Bayard must have known them well enough that he could make a call and get them to come out, because it's like Stevie Wonder was there. Little Stevie Wonder was there. I mean, I just give you a little background, like you all know this. When I think about it, I go, wow, little Stevie Wonder was there. They were raising money at the Apollo with a concert, raising money for the March on Washington. Guess who organized that? Bayard Rustin, right? The guy for whom music really mattered, and he understood the power of music. There's something I'm sure both of you know this, but I read this the other day that was interesting. I did not know that Thurgood Marshall, and Bayard were friendly as younger men. And apparently, when in Bowers versus Hardwick from 1987, which was the case that's allowed Texas to still make homosexual activity illegal as a state law, that was eventually overturned in Texas versus Lawrence. Bowers versus Hardwick, in the dissenting opinion, Thurgood Marshall rejected Texas law. And apparently he said it was his relationship with Bayard and what Bayard went through that affected his decision. I don't know if either of you knew this, but that is an incredible moment to think that Thurgood Marshall was so aware of the sensitivity of what had happened to Bayard, how he had been persecuted as a gay man at that time, that he wanted to stand up for him on the Supreme Court. All right, let's listen to another clip.
I think the movement contributed to this nation a sense of universal freedom, precisely because women saw our movement in the 60s stimulated them to want their rights. The fact that students saw the movement of the 60s created a student movement in this country. The fact that the people who were against the war in Vietnam saw us go into the street and win made it possible for them to have the courage to go into the street and win.
So, gentlemen, look, this guy taught America how to protest. He just did. He taught America how to protest. His protests led to the integration of the U.S. military. His protests led to the Civil Rights Act, to the bringing integration to public accommodations, to interstate travel. This is Rustin. It's his tactics. It's his strategy. And others followed him in that way, even though he did it from behind the scenes. But here's something that I want to ask that I think is a hard question to answer. We're not seeing that today. We're seeing a very different kind of protest. And I'm wondering, Walter, what would Bayard say? We're seeing one that is more violent. There's, there are fires that are started, people gluing themselves to the street and pavements, scuffling with the police. I'm wondering whether, he taught us how to protest effectively and achieve positive results. And I'm not so sure that what we're seeing on the streets nowadays constitutes positive results. Guys?
Well, I think, Bayard was committed to nonviolence, and nonviolence is about building community, about bringing people together and working out your differences through negotiation, sometimes through singing together, eating together, and creating, building bridges and creating a community. Now, it's taking demonstrations today, which for all practical purposes, they may not be violent, but they're not nonviolent. On the other hand, those are the things that make the news. The vast majority of the people, I think, in these demonstrations are behaving in a nonviolent fashion. It's just the ones that, for lack of a better term, stir up the trouble, if you will. Well, that's much more interesting to photograph somebody fighting with the police or being arrested than to photograph a group of people sitting peacefully holding signs. So it's
Well,
partly, what's covered in the news.
but in the 1960s, guys, we saw violence. We saw white policemen in Alabama putting the hoses on and literally washing away African Americans from the streets with the thrusting. I mean, if people don't know this, this is something you should do after tonight's folks conversations. Go watch, what was happening in Mississippi and in Alabama when they were using dogs, attack dogs against African Americans. Because of Bayard and Martin Luther King, the African Americans weren't fighting back. They were passively taking it. And it does seem as if that this is, you may be right, Walter, that it's not the majority of people, but it is that images got on the news too. And it changed white America. White America was watching television, the 6 o'clock news, and they were watching African Americans being washed down the street with hoses. And it was so vulgar and grotesque, it turned people in favor of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So it's not as if, only through violence does it become newsworthy. I think one of the things that Bayard recognized and Gandhi recognized, which is that actually having people sitting at a lunch counter and having people pour ketchup on their heads, right, to degrade them and humiliate them is vulgar, but is newsworthy, and the images are very powerful, and America saw those images. So I'm just curious, do we know what Bayard would say? Would he have been involved in today's struggles?
Well, I think he'd be involved, but he would be pleading for nonviolence, and he would be
Right.
organizing nonviolent demonstrations. He wouldn't be, urging people to do some of the things that you said people were doing now. And he wouldn't be. He would be speaking out certainly against hate, whether it's hate for a particular ethnic group or a religious group, or even the cops. He would be talking about bringing people together. So, because we all have to learn to live together in the society and in the world at large, and you don't do that by dividing people.
People should know that among the many things he organized is he organized African American policemen to go to Washington without their guns. And he taught them how to respond in a nonviolent way, but in a way that will keep the peace. And this is really extraordinary that, Bayard Rustin was teaching Black cops how to conduct themselves under the principles of passive nonviolent resistance. I've always thought the image of that is just very powerful and profound. Let's take another clip because I've got something to come.
Well,
I want you to.
I'm sorry, Thane.
Go
Before we
ahead,
go
Bryan.
there, I
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
want to address a couple of things.
Yes, please
Um,
do.
One, I want to push back against this narrative that there was this extreme violence that only existed in the Deep South. Not that that's what you said. I just want to recognize that my parents, were products of the civil rights movement. My mother's from the St. Louis region. My father's from the Deep South. He's from South Georgia, and both of them, dealt with water hoses and dogs and unthinkable violence as children while protesting. And even the March on Washington, there was fear amongst politicians, amongst agencies, that it would turn violent.
Yeah.
Malcolm X, pushed back against the March on Washington. He thought that it was really just a photo op for the Kennedy administration.
Yeah.
So there have always been opposing views on how we should protest. Now we're speaking today about King and Rustin's, idea of how we protest nonviolently. But there's always been differing opinions, and those opinions still exist today. My friend and colleague led a massive John Batiste led a massive nonviolent protest, for Black Lives Matter during the pandemic, and that got on the news, but it was one of thousands of nonviolent protests that did not make it on the news. So
But
I just,
do you think that
I'm
the
sorry.
nonviolent part, the ones that what you just described, Brian, that those people were doing what they thought Martin Luther King would have approved of, or did they even know who Bayard was? You think?
I'm not sure if they knew who Rustin was. I'm not sure if they knew, any of the civil rights leaders who took part in the march on Washington, but they're
You're just saying
certainly
it was
familiar
natural
with
for
those
them,
ideas.
right?
Yeah,
Right. It
they're
was
sure,
natural,
they're certainly familiar with those ideas. But
right?
you're in the heat of the moment when emotions are running high, things can happen, violence can ensue. But you know, I I would love to believe that for the majority of people who are protesting today, you know, I can't tell you how many protests I attended over the pandemic and how few of them were violent. I would
Yeah.
like to believe that everyone goes out there with the intention of, really just exercising their constitutional right to speak against things that
So
they don't agree with.
right. Well, I'm happy to hear that. I mean, that only pleases me to hear that that is your assessment of what overall that we saw. Let's take another clip.
The man who organized this whole thing, Mr. Bayard Rustin.
Ladies and gentlemen, the first demand is that we have effective civil rights legislation, no compromise, no filibuster, and that it includes public accommodations, decent housing, integrated education, FAPC, and the right to vote. What do you say?
So that was very moving. But I'll tell you what that makes me think. He's rolling out proposals, platforms that actually became federal law, right? He's talking about what eventually became the principles of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the various regulations under the various titles in the Civil Rights Act that picks up on the various rights that he was just addressing. But when I see that, my first thought is, okay, why are we still using the word systemic racism? It seems a little irreconcilable to me. There is a lot of racism in the United States. There's no doubt. There's tons of it. But we in the last 5 years or so, we got used to using the word systemic racism. And it sounds to me from what we just heard that Bayard was saying, we got to get racism out of the system. And so we need laws to protect African Americans with certain rights. So I remember I even wrote about this gentleman in an article like 3 or 4 years ago. And I said, I think we're underestimating the extraordinary amount of racial progress that we've made in this country. And I think that Bayard, again, Walter, you will know, I would not know. I would hope to think that Bayard would see that. And instead we were told America has never been more racist. It's never been worse than this. And I'm thinking, really? I mean, I'm remembering, what happened to, Medgar Evers, right? The girls in the church in Birmingham, Alabama, the 3 civil rights workers in Meridian, Mississippi, who were killed. That's what Rustin and cohorts were fighting against, and I think they succeeded.
They did. They did succeed to a large degree. I think where we did not make progress and where we still need to move really is in the economic front, because a lot of the feelings that we attribute to just racial animosity really has more to do with feelings about poor people and how they behave and how they act and this and that. If there was more economic equity and equality in this country, a lot of that other stuff would fall to the wayside.
Well,
Bayard would be the first to point out the progress that we've made over the last 60 years or so. But he would also note that we have a ways to go. And in fact, there are forces that are at work today who are trying to turn back the clock. They're not going to turn it back to where it was in the 50s and 60s, but who wants to go back even to the 90s or the early 2000s? I mean, we need to keep moving forward.
Well, all I'm wondering, I'm only speculating, gentlemen, is that I'm wondering whether John Lewis died recently. There are not many of the giants of the civil rights movement. There are just not many, if any, alive at this point. And I'm of a certain age, and again, I was very, very, very interested in the 1960s in the civil rights movement. So I knew stuff, paid attention, read things, and wrote about stuff. And I always wondered, well, what would these guys and women who fought for civil rights say? Because the way it's being presented today, it's as if those things never happened. And I feel like, Rustin was forgotten twice. He was forgotten by his own people in the civil rights movement, and the achievements were forgotten. That all of a sudden it was like, racism has never been worse than it is now. And it's the president of the United States would walk around the country, say the words systemic racism. It wasn't clear to me that Joe Biden knew what that even meant, but he used the words. And I kept thinking, is it in the system or is it in the heart of Americans? And I think that's a question that it's impossible to discuss Rustin without raising that point. I think it's impossible to not point out that I wonder what he would say, because it seems like you have not just forgotten, you have, diminished, trivialized all that was achieved.
Go
ahead, Bryan, please.
Thane, I remember being, 8 or 9 years old, and learning about the civil rights movement, and my grandmother being in town and sitting down and discussing the civil rights movement with her.
I'm sorry, is this the woman from St. Louis?
Yes. Yep.
Okay,
my grandmother and my mother's mother, and saying, right, Grandma, you all marched, and then you won, and the Civil Rights Act happened, and racism is over, and now you can go and you can eat lunch with your white colleagues. And my grandmother looked at me and said, "Oh, that's what they're teaching you at school. That's not what the civil rights movement was about for us. For me and for your mother and for your father and for your uncles and your aunts, that's not what it was about for us. It was about protecting against police brutality. It was about making sure that from a systemic view, from the system, that we have equal opportunity to live in great neighborhoods, and to be given access to great education, and to be given access to fair subsidization, to be given access to those things." Now, from my point of view, those are things that we're still fighting for. You brought up Bayard Rustin training Black police officers to basically behave, non-violently. He took away their guns. That's something that we're still talking about in 2024.
You mean a variation of defunding the police to demilitarize the police?
How do we demilitarize the New York Police Department? How do we really need tanks? Does the NYPD need a collection of 200 helicopters? Does the NYPD need robo dogs that can patrol the subway? Do we need those things? Can we invest in de-escalation units instead of sending 20 armed police officers out to deal with someone who's having a mental health crisis? Can we send someone who can speak with them, a mental health professional, along with a peace officer, to de-escalate the situation where no one is shot? Those are still things that we're having conversations about and we're still fighting about today. Now,
go ahead.
When we talk about a systemic issue, what we're talking about is that the systems that exist that lead to laws and legislation that enable these things to happen.
Let's play another clip. Now that piece, everyone saw that was Bryan on the drums, as well as Bryan functioning as the arranger and conductor. That is a song that is widely associated. This is to me, sounds like a gospel version of it a little, in my view. It is not normally sung that way. There are decades of Americans who remember that song as the final song that Jerry Lewis would sing at the end of the muscular dystrophy telethon. And it was an interesting way of looking at it. He was raising money for children that couldn't walk. And I think some people are oftentimes critical, like, why are you singing that song, You'll Never Walk Alone, when in fact they can't walk? But I think Lewis's position is, no, the purpose of this song is to tell everyone that we stand up for people, that we stand up, that's what this means. We will stand beside you. There are all kinds of examples. Jackie Robinson, as you may remember, that first year, it was miserable for him everywhere he went. And there's that very famous photograph of Pee Wee Reese, who came from the Deep South, who was his shortstop, running over while a very, very violent day of the N-word was being used endlessly. And Robinson was told to never respond, so he sat there. Pee Wee Reese runs up to him, puts his arm around him, and so the whole stadium sees him with his arm around him. Jackie Robinson turns to him and he goes, Pee Wee, what's up? And he goes, nothing, I'm just looking at the field, nothing. As if he's sending a message, that's my guy. That's my guy. It's a black man. He's my first baseman. He's my teammate, and I'm standing with him. And I wondered whether that, for you, Bryan, is why that song would be even meaningful when you're thinking about Rustin.
So the clip that we just watched was from a performance called Jazz at Pride. It was a performance I put on for the first World Pride here in New York City, and the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots. And the piece, You'll Never Walk Alone, is by Rodgers and Hammerstein. It's from the musical Carousel. And for me, I chose it because it conveys such a strong sense of community, of helping your neighbor, helping your brother, your sister when they're down.
Walter, how significant was it that Bayard dealt with two issues that were problematic in the 1960s, certainly for a black man? He had a long string of associations with communism. He followed a Trotskyite, and he had, he'd been in prison for, some sexual and California crime for being gay. What really did these things shape him in ways? Because clearly it made it possible for his enemies to dismiss him. That's true. But do you think that they were so formative also that he would not be Bayard, everything about Bayard, without those two facets? It wasn't just that he had black skin, it's that he was gay and he was a communist at the wrong time.
Well, yeah, I mean, they certainly shaped him, but they never, he would never disavow any of his behavior and any of his beliefs, because this was the process of growing. And, he had a flirtation with communism for a very short time, and he remained a democratic socialist throughout the rest of his life. But he, the last few lyrics of You'll Never Walk Alone is walk on with hope in your heart, and you'll never walk alone. And Bayard was somebody who was always very hopeful. And so he was always very positive. So no matter what was being thrown at him, what garbage or what pessimism or anything, he bounced back. I mean, that was their problem. If they didn't like him because he was gay, that was their problem. If they didn't like him because he was black, that was their problem. He came to grips with all of these things early on in his life. And he just moved forward and carried on and did not let anybody turn him around.
Bryan, in Rustin in Renaissance, there must be, I suspect, pieces of music and lyrics that address the question of him being gay and also perhaps being a communist?
Yes, actually. Well, for one, there's an entire movement simply entitled Walter that is written for
I love that.
the person who's sitting to my right on the screen. Um, but beyond that, we definitely address his very, very brief stint with communism in a piece, the second movement, called Mr. Rustin. I was telling Walter the other day that, you know, in the biographies that I've read, there always seemed to be like this, you know, mystery surrounding Bayard, which I personally I just love, you know. And so within this movement, all of the singers are speaking to each other, and they're asking, you know, Bayard questions. They're like, I heard you sing to Nazis on trains, and that you were in a musical with Paul Robeson, and is it true that you were a communist? You know, when did this happen? Should we forgive you for that? When was this? Why
Yeah.
did you step away from them? You know, so we definitely address all of those things. I want to add to, you know, for some historical context, that one, Bayard was extremely young when he was working with the Young Communist League, but also he stepped away once he kind of realized that their missions didn't align, and that they had made promises about wanting to help with racism and desegregation and the racial issues in America, and
that was not
quickly
right.
discovered that they were not going to address those things.
Let's go back to systemic racism and some other issues you just raised, Bryan. He was a very enigmatic figure, a very complicated figure. On the one hand, we just said he was a communist, but that's not how I knew him. I knew him as a neoconservative. I knew him as a guy that wrote for Commentary Magazine and hung out with Scoop Jackson and Daniel Patrick Moynihan. I knew him as a guy that was a little iffy on affirmative action and wasn't totally in love with Black studies programs, and definitely didn't love Black nationalism, because this was a guy that was trying to build we saw a clip. He was trying to bring women in and Jews. He was trying to build alliances. And so to him, the idea of Malcolm X and the Black nationalist movement, Marcus Garvey, that was something that never really resonated with him. So here's a guy who we talk of as if he was a communist, but there are people like me who remember him in a very, very different way, and including what I'd like to say, his, you know, we see, and I'll raise this again in another question, but, you know, his lieutenants were Jews. You know, there was not a stripping away. You know, his friends, Stanley Levinson, frankly, also I think betrayed him, along with Martin Luther King. But he had friends. I think his chief lieutenant was a woman named, you would know this, Walter, Rochelle something Levinson. Horowitz. Rochelle Horowitz. I think she was a key member of his team. You know, I think they adored each other. And so I look at him and think of a guy as a really great bridge builder. And that's why he was a little on the neoconservative side. Do I have that right?
No.
Am I overstating that?
Yes. You're old enough to remember Commentary in the 1960s when they published From Protest to Politics, among other articles that Bayard wrote. And at that time, it was a liberal journal. It was not a neoconservative journal. Now, if you ask I would say the grandmother of neoconservative, the late Midge Decter, she would say that Bayard was not a neoconservative. Where he agreed with Midge and her husband Norman Podhoretz and others in that movement, he agreed with their anti-communism line. But he did certainly not agree. He was not an economic conservative. He remained a socialist, a social democrat all through his life. And Midge and Norman were not. They moved away from socialist politics. So they were really neoconservative, but Bayard was not.
Yeah, but you know,
some people like to throw him in that category.
I think I did.
Really
well, let me just say, here's something that I think is, you know, just last week we knew that Israel was fighting a new war on a new front with Lebanon and Iran. And I saw that in 1970, are you ready for this? What is this, 54 years ago, right? 54 years ago. So, wow. Bayard wrote in the New York Times and was quoted as saying that he thought the United States should be sending jets to Israel so they could fight their wars against the Arab countries that were attacking them. And I think at the time people were really, what? Why is this is a guy that's, not interested in the military? What is he doing now? I've said this over the last year, Bayard Rustin and Martin Luther King were Zionists. They saw it as a liberation movement for Jews. They didn't see it the way it's being portrayed. But I thought that was an extraordinary thing that I saw, that Bayard Rustin was encouraging the United States to send fighter jets to help Israel fight its war. Now, I see that Walter's smirking. So I'm wondering whether he has better insight into this, because I saw that as another enigmatic part of this guy's really extraordinary story.
Well, the quote that you're referring to was part of a full-page ad in the New York Times, which became the basis for a group called Black Americans to Support Israel, BASIC, which I think was around for about six years or so in the 1970s. And if you look at the signatures on that ad, you will see Coretta King, you'll see Daddy King, you'll see, I think, Ralph Abernathy, John Lewis.
Just to be clear to the audience, I'm sorry, Walter, Daddy King means Martin Luther King's father.
Correct. Yeah, this was after
Right.
Dr. King was assassinated.
Yeah, that's not obvious to everyone what you're saying. Okay.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah.
It's okay.
I think there's some controversy about the latter part, the business about sending military jets to Israel. I mean, that's in the
So
ad. I'm not denying it's in the ad, but how it actually got in there, and whether Bayard was fully aware that it was being put in there, as opposed to being put in there by some of his colleagues, remains a question. But I think what I think we should make clear is that Bayard was a strong supporter of the right of Israel to exist.
Right.
And he was a strong supporter of Israel. And regardless of what's happened in the last 37 years since he died, he would still be a supporter of the right of Israel to exist as the nation state of the Jewish people, and he would be supporting a two-state solution. Doesn't mean he would agree with everything that's happened, especially everything that's happened in the last year. But certainly when it came to the basic right of Israel to exist as a nation, he would support that.
It's funny, you're reminding me, Walter, when we did that night with Marshall, with Sterling K. Brown and Chadwick Boseman, and Josh Gad, who played the Jewish lawyer, I said, and they all jumped in on this. They were all interested in it. Is to say people that would watch this movie would be shocked to see a Jewish guy and a black guy working together to, exonerate a wrongly accused black chauffeur. It's just seen very different things got twisted, and the relationships seemingly are twisted. And they were struggling. I remember seeing them all on stage trying to say, yeah, we realized we were making a film that didn't, that was of its era. It was from the 40s, early 50s, when Marshall was a young lawyer right out of Howard Law School. That's what that movie's about. It's a young, cool, Thurgood Marshall running around the United States defending black people for being falsely accused of crimes. It's very romantic and heroic story of what Marshall was. But one of the things that troubles me about race relations today is we don't seem to have the same alliances and solidarity. We have it only in the context of intersectionality, that everyone who is sort of a certain victimhood carries an obligation to one another, but there's no real relationship with the privileged white people. I'm wondering. I'm just saying, would Bayard say, "Yeah, I don't like that"?
I think I would strongly disagree with that.
Good.
Intersectionality, exists. I'm a part of an intersectional community, but I tell people all the time. People want to talk about my queerness or whatever. I always say it's one of the least interesting things about me at the end of the day. But it is a part of who I am. I run a nonprofit, that exists to promote LGBTQ people within band rooms and orchestra rooms across America and within the jazz community. But, you know, I think that empathy has always existed and empathy will continue to exist. You know, I think that empathy extends beyond class. I think that empathy extends beyond race or gender identity. And I think that what we see on the news and certainly what sells ad time and ad revenue is discussing all of our differences and all of the things that exist to separate us. And I've had so many meaningful, productive conversations with people with whom ideologically I couldn't disagree more. You know, I couldn't have less in common with those people than, you know, than what I'm trying to describe right now. But I've still been able to have meaningful dialogue. You know, I wasn't there. I can't speak to if things are better or worse. But as we talk about Dr. King and Bayard's relationship, the fourth movement of Rustin Renaissance, you know, is called King, and their disagreements at times it feels that it's reduced to, you know, there were rumors and then King pushed Bayard away, and they had strong ideological differences in a lot of different areas. You know, they had policy differences in a lot of different areas. You know, it extends beyond just sexuality.
Well, let me just, for the audience that doesn't know, because this is a little more nuanced historical fact, which was that Adam Clayton Powell, who was, you know, probably the most significant public figure as an elected official in the United States, he was a congressman out of Harlem, who had no real affection for either, frankly, King or certainly Rustin, threatened to go public and say that they were gay, that Martin Luther King and Rustin were lovers. And that was one of the reasons, apparently, why Martin Luther King was willing to let him go, because he realized in his mind he could never survive that politically, that the world would think, even though it wasn't true, to my knowledge, it wasn't true, but that the fact that Adam Clayton Powell, that's what's really so troubling about that, right? That's why I said about Mean Boys, that some of the what really in many ways undermined Rustin most was not J. Edgar Hoover. People think it's the FBI. It was really Black leaders in the movement, which is, to me, another tragic level of the betrayal. So let me. There's got some great questions from the audience. Can I do that, and then we'll say goodnight? You guys ready?
Sure.
Here we go. How can we make Bayard Rustin better known? Is this strictly an education issue, or do we need more pieces of culture and art to call attention to him and his contributions?
Well, I think all of the above, certainly. Bayard was, for lack of a better term, a Renaissance man. And there are many ways to get into Bayard, through music, through his art collection, you know, all of the various facets that he had. So certainly the Netflix film has tremendously lifted his profile in the last year. But there are numerous books. There was a wonderful documentary called Brother Outsider, The Life of Bayard Rustin, which is also streaming on Netflix now, along with Rustin. Yeah. I think, you know, getting him into the curriculum, getting him into the school classrooms is a very important step. But at the same time, you have to realize, well, how many people did kids come away with hearing about? They know Dr. King. They know Malcolm X. And Malcolm X was not a civil rights leader. He was a Black separatist. Do they know A. Philip Randolph? Do they know James Farmer? Do they know Roy Wilkins? No. So, I mean, you know, Bayard, yes, we want people to know about him, but we also want people to know that this was about a movement. It was about lots of people, and it was about ordinary people getting out there in the streets and marching, people that you will never hear of. So it was a collective struggle.
Bryan, I think you might have answered this in a little way, but this is a question I still think is important, worth exploring. Bryan, is there a particular experience in your life that got you interested in Rustin? And was there something musical, a piece you heard, for example, that also made you want to make this composition? For instance, many people know that the YouTube song "In the Name of Love" is named for MLK. Why were these Irish guys, brogues from a pub in Dublin? They were inspired by Martin Luther King. There's something really beautiful about that, actually. I remember when that song came out in the 80s, and I went, wow, that's really amazing. That's a great song, and it's about Martin Luther King. As Walter said, everybody knows King, but there's less people who would know fewer people. But was there something other, like music, other things that drew you to him that made you think, you know what? It's not just what Mark Shaman said. I told him that he should do it, and he said I should do it. This was always in me somehow, and I always thought there was music about Rustin that I could make real.
Hmm.
It's a tough one.
It is a tough one.
Because
I
artists
think
don't
that
oftentimes know, right? Artists doesn't oftentimes know what draws the subject, right?
sure. I don't know if there was anything musical that made me, want to write about Rustin. I think that just his story is so compelling in and of itself. And he lived such a long, full, incredible, meaningful life and impacted so many people that there's so much to write about, to compose music, about and or around. In terms of just musical figures that would make me want to take on a project like this, I think of people like Ellington, who introduced so many suites into the genre, from New Orleans suite to Queen suite, just really incredible, long form compositions, even to Wynton Marsalis, who you said, was a guest on a guest speaker here. When I think about Wynton and Blood on the Fields, and even Ever Funky Lowdown, or just those pieces.
That's what we did, by the way, Brian. Ever Funky Lowdown.
Great.
That's what we did.
Yeah.
It was really great.
But just the way that they're able to really make people to convey their message and make people feel something. They don't have to tell them. They can, speak musically, and people can feel the things for themselves.
So, Brian, before we say goodnight, I want to say, I'm going to be there on either the 18th or the 19th. I'm really excited. I mean, I really, a bunch of us from the FOLCS team will be there. Some of our board members will be there. You're going to have a fan club from us. We're all
I look forward to it.
No, are you kidding? We're going to be cheering. This is really an incredible accomplishment. And also, I don't know what Walter would say about this, because Walter's dedicated a large part of his life to the memory of Bayard. So to me, this feels like a moral act, not just an aesthetic act. Yes, it's musical and aesthetic, but it has moral. If you want to look back on your career and look at what do I really, really want to hold out as something that I'm proud of, I hope you'll remember. You don't need me to tell you this, Brian, but this is something, the ambition of this, the scale of this, the aspiration of what you were trying to achieve and why, says a lot about you, frankly, as an artist and an African-American and an American. And I just think there's a lot to be admired. And Walter, I really, your story is so enormously interesting because you were much younger than Bayard. And I can tell the audience something that not everybody knows, is that this is before same-sex marriage was permissible. Bayard was so principled, and he understood the value of creating legal status, right? He understood, he wasn't a lawyer, but he understood legal status was important. He adopted you as a son, and you went through an entire process. You were his lover, but the only thing he could do is adopt you in order to create a legal status. And I think that I'd never heard that before. And it's an incredible story. And I think your commitment to him is just beautiful, Walter. So before we say goodnight, go ahead, Walter. Sorry.
No, thank you for your kind words.
Well, they're sincerely expressed, both of you. So let's just couple of quick announcements of upcoming events. FOLCS goes to Broadway over the next month. It's Job, starring, it's a two-person play, Peter Friedman and Sidney Lemon. And the playwright will be there also, Max Wolf Friedlich. And that is on Wednesday, 10/22. There are discounted tickets for FOLCS. So if you click on that, you'll see we're providing discounted tickets so you can come watch it. This is a new show, Vladimir. My understanding is that it's about the first election that Vladimir Putin ran in Russia and the story of a journalist that covered it. And we have several of the cast members. Brian will be impressed with this. We have Daniel Sullivan, who Brian surely knows as one of the leading theater directors, and that's on Wednesday, the 30th. And again, there are discounted tickets. Just go to the QR code. Of course, donate. We want you to think of us as one of your favorite nonprofits. We haven't charged tickets since the pandemic, since we went virtual, and sometimes we go live. And what else? If you're not yet part of our community, stay in touch. Make sure you leave us your email address so you can know about all our cool upcoming events. This will live, gentlemen, in our archives forever. You can always see this. It'll be on our website and our YouTube channel. Tens of thousands of people will watch it all the time. We're always amazed at how many people come back and watch it and send the links. So this will live forever. And I think you both acquitted yourself so well that it's nice to have a record of you both. So thank you, Brian. Thank you, Walter. I'm Thane Rosenbaum for FOLCS. Until next time. Good night, everyone.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.